Chapter 30, the note of convention, swallowing up all authenticity, is noted really just from the start. That evening, when Archer came down before dinner, he found the drawing room empty. He and May were dining alone, all the family engagements having been postponed since Mrs. Manson Mingott's illness. And as May was the more punctual of the two, he was surprised that she had not preceded him. He knew that she was at home, for while he dressed he had heard her moving about in her room, and he wondered what had delayed her. He had fallen into the way of dwelling on such conjectures as a means of tying his thoughts fast into reality. Sometimes he felt as if he had found the clue to his father-in-law's absorption in trifles. Perhaps even Mr. Welland long ago had had escapes and visions, and had conjured up all the hosts of domesticity to defend himself against them. Archer suggests that his father-in-law, whom he does not think much of, the routine of his life is starting to ape that of his father-in-law's rather stifled existence, and you can see his hesitation about that. He is becoming just another one of the pale New Yorkers of the upper class, who are not really living their lives, but just going through the motions of it, just being told what to do, where to go, what to wear, what to think. And this is somewhat frustrating that Archer sees his life slowly settling towards that inevitability. It is his reaction to it is a kind of cri de coeur for some of the novel's more literary ambitions as well. The instincts of the first half of the novel that showed a little bit more ambition, a little bit more avant-garde sensibility, with the psychological profiling, with the interior monologue. All of that seems to be getting stifled as well. The steady busyness of the plot is starting to overtake some of the more nuanced psychological exploration. The behavioral performativity is snuffing out the richness of the narration that we had throughout the first half of the book. The privacy of reading itself is suggested in that routine. We're told about we're told that after the couple's dinner, they went up to the library for coffee, and Archer lit a cigar and took down a volume of Michelet. He had taken to history in the evening, since May had shown a tendency to ask him to read aloud whenever she saw him reading a volume of poetry. Not that he disliked the sound of his own voice, but because he could always foresee her comments on what he read. In the days of their engagement, she had simply, as he now perceived, echoed what he told her. But since he had ceased to provide her with opinions, she had begun to hazard her own, with results destructive to his enjoyment of the works commented on. That frustrating independence that he seemed to be so encouraged by, seemed to be so in favor of, is now turning on him a little bit, and he feels a little put out. Significantly, I think you can say that that Newland's tastes have gone from poetry to history as a kind of a reflection of the trajectory of the Age of Innocence in general, where the poetry, where the more soaring possibility of the first half of the novel are becoming much more materialist, much more objective. In the second, poetry represents a more deeply personal and complex field of interpretation. History purports to be a steady empirical laying out of events and behavior. You don't generally get a lot of psychology in history. You get actions, what people do, their outward behavior. It's a much less evocative way of depicting reality. Notably as well, Newland grows annoyed with poetry, specifically because May asks him to read aloud for her, which is another kind of public performance of what for him had been a very private interior pleasure. He rejects her participation in the act of reading. This signals, yes, his sexist attitudes within the character, but also a kind of insistence on the division between the interior and the exterior, between public performance and personal integrity, which is a note that I think is very significant for this book as a whole. Newland and May overall have a very dull marriage, steadily succumbing to the same kind of dynamic that her parents have, and that Newland so regrets. Archer even finds himself speculating at a certain point on what his life would be like if May were to die, which is perhaps a very human thing to imagine. Those moments when you're with someone and you're just wondering, well, what if you weren't there? What could my life be? Is it just the institution of marriage, or the proximity of May as a character herself, who is preventing him from doing all that he dreams of being, all of his ambitions? Is it really her? If you took her away and you took away all of the constraints, so he's always fantasizing about escaping, what would be left? Would he still be the same person? Would he still feel hemmed in? Remember, he has a lot of the same prejudices against Olenska's behavior as his society. There is a suggestion that, well, okay, it's not all outward. All of the constraints are not all exterior. Many of the constraints on Newland are, in fact, within himself. But also throughout this chapter, we learn that the Beauforts and Madame Olenska are both planning to be sticking around for a little while in New York. There had been speculation that they should all just sort of disappear, leave the social scene, perhaps the Beauforts could go back down south to where they have some other roots, live as, exiled aristocrats in gentlemanly and much more forgiving, perhaps, South Carolina, or somewhere in the deep south. And of course, Olenska should just go back to Europe and, just be out of sight, out of mind. But their decision among all of them to remain in New York is a point of some frustration for the high society. Catherine Mingott is recovering. Her stroke turned out to be relatively minor, and she is getting back around. She enlists Archer as an ally in fending off her family's campaign to kick Ellen out, or kick Ellen out. And there is this interesting relationship blossoming between this older, very obese and somewhat blunt-talking woman with this very younger Archer, who is perhaps seeing in Catherine, a bit of a similar spirit to his own. So they have some independence of mind in common, and perhaps she has even more than he does because he is so offended by her sometimes. So there's that developing, but all of these little plot points, so the romance between Olenska and Archer, the marriage developments between May and Archer, the pot boiling stuff going on about New York society and the Beauforts and all of this stuff. All of this primacy of plot is churning, 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 and it seems to be ironing out a lot of the idiosyncrasies of the first half of the novel. But the memory of that, the impression of that much more ambitious, perhaps, that much more fractious at times, much more disjointed at times style of the first half of the novel. The memory of that remains, and we're sitting there comparing as we're going through, and it seems like a contrast, and they are calling one another, those two styles, into contrast. The relatively more psychologically focused first half, and the more plot focused exterior behavioral aspect to the second half. With the contrast between the two of them, you can see each for a little bit more clearly. You can see each one a little bit more objectively, because they are calling, or they are casting light on one another. This is again an interesting parallel in the evolution of realist and modernist art, and the frustrating fits and starts that we see is modernism being born into or through the realist era. And that is not always a particularly smooth process. And you can see how perhaps Edith Wharton, who's coming just at the moment when modernism is really creaking out into the world, she doesn't quite make it over that finish line in the same way that a next generation of writers are just about to. Chapter 31, more plot stuff. Newland turns the latest developments over in his mind about, and readers are privy to this. He's going over the plot in his mind, but the stream of his thoughts is distinctly objective in its portrayal. It lacks a lot of the interiority of the earlier soliloquies where he's sitting there by the fire and speculating. Here it's a little bit more distance, a little bit more cold. Time and again, the intricacies of the plot prove to be kind of misdirection. They're shiny objects that are dragging the attention away from what's really going on. Archer himself is mistaken in his survey of the circumstances and the conclusions he draws right at the start of chapter 31, walking out of Catherine Mingott's home after their little interview. And he learns through her that Olenska is going to be staying in New York. He draws some conclusions from that. He tries to read through that action, that behavior, and draw his own interpretation of it. And it's not necessarily all that accurate. Archer was sure that Madame Olenska's decision had not been influenced by the change in her financial situation. He knew the exact figure of the small income which her husband had allowed her at their separation. Without the addition of her grandmother's allowance, it was hardly enough to live on in any sense known to the Mingott vocabulary. And now that Medora Manson, who shared her life, had been ruined, such a pittance could barely keep the two women clothed and fed. Yet Archer was convinced that Madame Olenska had not accepted her grandmother's offer from interested motives. Archer concludes that the real motive behind Ellen's choice to stay in New York is that she is signaling her consent to have an affair. This is a romantic impulse on his part, and it's contrasted to the financial compulsion that he dismisses. Says, well, no, she's not just sticking around because she needs her grandmother's money. She really wants me. He is going at this from a romantic perspective, in opposition to the financial considerations that tend to be more a hallmark of realist art. The idea that people are striving to or limited by their financial situations, their economic realities, the limitations of their material lives. So you can see already there's a little bit of a romantic instinct going on in this book, a little bit of a realist outlook in contrast, and you're not sure where the truth lies within that. You're never really sure, and that's really the modernist instinct, where you're just uncertain of anything. You have no real foundation. Everything is up for grabs. The comparison itself, however, is very conspicuous. It draws attention to the aesthetics of it, the romanticism, the realism, the modernism coming in. But it also suggests that neither frame really fits. Neither frame really encompasses everything. And that's the modernism of it. The melodrama, however, keeps crescendoing. The novel is steaming ahead with all of this stuff, and he's trying to figure out, are we going to get together? Are we going to get to have this affair? Are we going to get to consummate this love? Or, what's the financial situation? What's the reality of it? And we have all of this intrigue going on around the Beauforts and the scandal and all of this stuff that is just all soap opera stuff that is irrelevant largely to the true focus of this novel. But the crowding in of the true focus by all of the busyness, by all of the stuff, the melodrama, the soap opera-ish, that is an interesting contrast to watch. That is the war that is going on in this book for Wharton in her ambitions to become a modern writer, a modernist writer. And the mechanisms of the plot are just an excuse, honestly, for making this drama happen underneath the surface of all of that. When Newland and Archer go to meet in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which we are told explicitly does not exist yet in the 1870s in its current 1920s iteration as the big building in Central Park that we all still know. This is so it's kind of objectified by history. It's kind of distanced, like, oh, okay, that's that. And then they have this little heart-to-heart talk, and it's very melodramatic, and they're exchanging different. It's very dialogue-y, but it's happening in an art museum. Now, it's similar in many respects to the talk that they had in the carriage coming back when she's coming back to New York after getting off the train. It's similar to their other exchange in the woods outside. Notice how we're getting closer and closer to New York all along, where they start out talking in the woods. Now they're talking then they were talking on the way to New York. Now they're in the heart of New York, but not just the heart of New York, in an art museum. This is about art. So as you were reading this, you're realizing that, well, this is just another scene between the two of them where they're expressing heartfelt emotions, but also the frustrations and the limitations of their circumstances. But it's art. It's fake. It's false. Everything about this is performative. The prevailing concern for both of them is that they not seem like everybody else in New York, just having a cheap affair. For Newland, it's about being judged. He's a very judgmental character himself. He doesn't want to be judged, and he is much put off by the idea of just looking like Lawrence Lefferts or one of those guys who tell just the most scandalous lies and then go parading around their mistresses in public, and we're all supposed to just nod along with that. He's very disgusted by that. Olenska is more concerned with the appearance of that to May, the fact that it would have a real effect on May, that it would destroy May, whom Olenska sees as really responsible for saving her. She says, I would destroy the person who saved me. But it's all fake. it is all performative. You're never terribly sure about what Olenska is thinking. We're not given access to her thoughts through the mechanism of the novel. We are given access to the thoughts of Archer, but they all seem rather romantic, rather wishful, rather deluded. They're all struggling for some sense of meaning. They're all struggling to crack out of their circumstances. Just look at the ending of chapter 31. She flung her arms around his neck and pressed his cheek to her. "You haven't kissed me today," she said in a whisper, and he felt her tremble in his arms. That's Harlequin romance stuff. That is melodrama. That is Wharton just saying, well, yeah, okay, I'm dealing with all of this much deeper, more psychological stuff, but I'll toss in this because we got to keep the plot moving. That's why you're turning the pages. But also that points out how phony all of this is, how phony this is as a novel, how phony this is as people living their lives. They are all performing a kind of art. They're all playing a role. They are all playing make-believe in one way or another. And if everybody is, and if the writing itself is doing that, then what can you trust? What is authentic? How can we believe anything that we see around us anymore? This is the stuff of this novel. And everything that Wharton is doing this, everything that Wharton is suggesting through this novel is about driving home that point, that uncertainty, that untethered quality to all of the old rules are no longer applicable. We can't trust anything anymore. That's modernism.